Before I begin my review of this new film, which goes by The Crow, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the origins of the source material this film claims to be based on. I could say that James O'Barr's The Crow is a 35-year-old comic book, and I'll be right. But I'd like to go back even further, all the way back to 1981 in fact, as that was the year the future author of the said comic book lost the love of his life to a drunk driver. And it was this tragedy which sent James O'Barr into a deep depression, and understandably so. Over the course of the next several years, O'Barr battled the demons that his bereavement awakened, but rather than become just another addiction or suicide statistic, he instead channeled his pain into creating an artwork which he got to live out his fantasies. The fantasies only a grief-stricken and rightly pissed-off artist would be dreaming of. Fantasies of revenge, retribution, and resurrection. All of the things he would never be able to make happen in the real world. The artwork became known to him and soon the entire comic book community as The Crow. And it was such an instant cult classic that a film adaptation was in the works only a couple of years after its 1989 release. And the resulting 1994 film was itself tainted by the tragedy of sudden, needless death. But even so, it still accomplished everything James O'Barr could have hoped for from the day he began working on turning the most negative event of his life into his most positive achievement as an artist. So if you were unaware of how The Crow came to be, now you know. The Crow was born out of the death of an innocent at the hands of a degenerate. So why the fuck are the protagonists of this new so-called adaptation of the story a pair of fucking degenerates? Why the fuck am I, or anyone with a shred of decency, meant to give a fuck about a pair of degenerates who go on a drug and alcohol-fueled joyride upon escaping rehab? And why the fuck should I root for a pair of degenerates who are really no different than the driver who in a drunken stupor shattered the lives of the friends and the family of the one they killed? And if you think I'm overreacting to this already doomed abomination of a film, you can't be much of a fan of the comic book or the original 1994 adaptation. The latter carried with it a hard anti-drug message. So when 30 years later a film comes along which romanticizes addiction, you better fucking believe that it's hard not to feel angry for James O'Barr and for every fan of The Crow who has struggled with addiction, known others who have struggled with addiction, and or lost loved ones to both addiction and to those who were addicted. So now that we've established that The Crow is a 1989 comic, which was adapted into a 1994 film, I'm just going to state outright that this new film does not deserve to be called The Crow in any way, shape, or form. You can call it whatever the fuck you want, but don't call it The Crow, as this is as far from the story James O'Barr wrote than a film can possibly get. Firstly, there is no crow guiding the protagonist. Yes, you heard that right. There are no moments in this film where the crow shows up to steer the protagonist forward in his quest for vengeance. There are definitely crows in the film, but they remain in the purgatory between the land of the living and the realm of the dead. And it's here that the protagonist finds himself upon his murder. But it's also the place he finds himself returning to several times during the course of the film. Yes, you heard that right. He doesn't run across rooftops. He doesn't stalk the streets in search of the ones who killed him and his lover. Instead, he receives instructions from an instantly forgettable, wise old man who appears to be the sole inhabitant of this aforementioned purgatory. And we are actually meant to believe that he stands around waiting for these newly dead, wrong souls to arrive so he can tell them how to set the wrong things right. I wished I was making this shit up, but I ain't. This is not The Crow, and should never be considered part of the Crow franchise. Anyway, back on Earth, our protagonist doesn't get to rise from the grave in memorable fashion like in the 1994 film. Instead, he wakes up at his own crime scene, much to the surprise of the typically corrupt cop in attendance. A fight ensues, and we quickly discover that while our protagonist may be immortal, he's not impervious to pain. In fact, He spends an awful lot of his time in this film on his fucking back, following a beatdown or having been blasted by several guns. He even returns to purgatory during such moments, and it all starts to feel like we're playing a video game where we're continually failing trial and error missions. Eventually, our protagonist does learn to take advantage of his powers, but the film does a terrible job of explaining exactly why he is the way he is. It's almost like he's in an RPG gaining experience points each time he engages in a fight. And it feels even more so like one given how the antagonists are almost nameless drones who serve no purpose other than to be killed. I cannot even remember the names of any of the few who actually had them. They are so devoid of personality and they all look and dress the same. You don't feel any satisfaction when they get slayed by the man they savagely killed earlier in the film. Now I will say that the film does earn its R rating with a blood-soaked second half, and the action sequences themselves are genuinely well handled, if a little too overloaded with CG blood effects. But while I'm no fan of that kind of thing, I will give this film a pass, purely because A, it's entertainingly executed, and B, I know I'm not the only one who didn't want a tragedy to befall anyone who worked on this film like it did the 1994 original. As much as the new film is an insult to its predecessor, no amount of shitty writing, shitty acting, or shitty filmmaking makes those responsible deserving of serious injury or worse. Thankfully, no one was hurt on set this time around, and as much as I hated this fucking film, I'll always admit that it boasts at least one outstanding action set piece. But I should also tell you that it's really the only action set piece in the entire film. If you can survive the first 80 minutes, you'll be treated to something truly terrific as our protagonist takes on an army of bad guys on Route 2 and inside an opera house. The choreography is genuinely cool, the violence is really extreme, and the choice to intercut this scene with the unbeknownst opera audience enjoying the show is so marvelous, it makes you wish the film hadn't been such a shit show up until then. Alas, the 2024 version of The Crow is one of the most lifeless, mind-numbing, and downright offensive films I've ever wasted 100 minutes of my life on. You get 10 minutes of genuinely fun action, but the remaining 90 minutes are filled with wall-to-wall bad acting, dialogue, and paper-thin characterization. Bill Skarsgård has proven himself to be a fine actor on both the big and small screen. While he's certainly up to the physical demands of this role, he's otherwise miscast as a man with the worst haircut I've seen in a film this year. His head-to-toe tattoos make him resemble the Machine Gun Kellys and Post Malones of the world, and the fact that the soundtrack, shockingly, doesn't feature music by them, saves it from being any worse than it already is. The same can be said of his co-star, FKA Twigs, a singer who's seemingly cast for no reason other than she may turn the eyes of her audience onto this film. Fuck knows it wasn't for her acting ability, because she possesses zero. Just that she shares zero chemistry with Skarsgård. Their love story is so utterly unconvincing and laughably rushed it makes the one from Halloween Ends seem believable by comparison. And again, the fact that these two play unsympathetic degenerates makes you root against them rather than for them. Even as they escape rehab to the soundtrack of Joy Division's classic Disorder, you'll shake your head at the filmmaker for taking you for such a fool. Now, the soundtrack in general isn't bad at all. In fact, it's one of the only positive things one can say about the shambles of a film. But even though it's nice to hear the likes of Joy Division and Enya during key scenes, it never feels like the filmmakers have given any thought to these songs or why they fit the scenes they play over. The score, on the other hand, is as dreary as the visual design. Even during the film's fantastical moments, the score fails to bring the film to life. You'll struggle to remember anything about it, just like you'll struggle to remember the names of the villains. And speaking of the villains, they are headed up by the usually dependable Danny Huston. He plays some kind of immortal soul trader. It's never really explained what he is, just what he can do. And if you've read James O'Barr's original comic, or watched Alex Proyas' 1994 film adaptation, you'll know that this character, like many things in the 2024 version of The Crow, is a million miles away from what The Crow has ever been. Honestly, he feels like he belongs in Constantine or something. His performance isn't much to write home about either, but one can hardly blame him given the material he's working with. As for the rest of the cast, what fucking cast? Literally no one outside Skarsgård, Twigs, and Houston gets enough screen time to be of any relevance to this story. This film is as empty as the purgatory it tries to sell us. So in closing, all I can say about this film is that it's by far the worst installment of The Crow I have ever sat through. Now I know many will point to 2005's Wicked Prayer and ask how could it possibly be worse than that? Well, while Wicked Prayer was indeed a massive piece of bird shit, it's still far more entertaining than this film. I can laugh my ass off throughout Wicked Prayer, because it really is as bad as they come. But this film manages to be the only thing worse than bad. It's boring as fuck. The performances are wooden rather than wildly over the top. The dialogue is dull rather than dumb as fuck. And the storyline is just bland rather than batshit crazy. Wicked Prayer was all of the latter and then some. That's why it's a laugh riot from beginning to end. This film is a bore fest which would test your patience and perhaps send you to sleep. If you do make it to the 80-minute mark, you'll get a wake-up call with that cool action sequences I mentioned. But by then, it's simply too little, too late. This film should never be referred to as The Crow, for all the reasons I've stated throughout this review. Call it the Goose instead. That's exactly what filmmaker Rupert Sanders sees it as. But it's not going to be laying him the golden egg he clearly thought it would. If you take a beloved story and treat it as nothing more than a cash cow, you'll never succeed. There is nothing in this film to suggest that Sanders was ever a fan of James O'Barr's original comic or Alex Proyas' first film adaptation. This is a cynical, clueless, and unforgivably crass butchering of The Crow. One can only hope that this shameless cash grab sees Rupert Sanders' stock plummet so low he never works on another film adaptation again. Perhaps this hack should take up something else. Maybe trimming hedges. Give it some thought, Rupert, because you're no fucking filmmaker, man. And I'll end this by saying that I chose very deliberately not to refer to the protagonist by the name that they were given in the film. I want to distance this piece of shit as far away from The Crow as possible. I also chose not to refer to the actor who sadly passed away in 1994 on the set of the first film adaptation. I didn't want to come across as one of those fans who is just hating on this film for the simple fact that the original film was so iconic and the performance of the said deceased actor was so iconic. It's really not like that. I was very much open to a new adaptation simply because the original was a very loose adaptation. I would have loved to have seen a faithful adaptation of the comic book. Something which would have been in black and white, something which would have had a talking crow, something which would have featured the Skull Cowboy, something which would have had musical interludes. We never got that. We got a piece of shit made for no other reason than to cash in on the name. So fuck you, Rupert Sanders, and fuck you, Lionsgate.